Thomas had never imagined his career in xenolinguistics would land him in a throne room that shimmered like the inside of a nebula. Columns of crystal spiraled up toward a ceiling that rippled with projected star maps, each constellation slowly turning, as if the room itself floated in space. The Illyrians, statuesque beings with graceful elongated ears and eyes that caught every glint of light, stood watching him as though he were a peculiar creature spilled from a cargo crate. He cleared his throat, the tiny translator disc at his collar vibrating faintly. Honored counselors in your luminescent serenity. His voice cracked. His guide, a door official named Varos, shot him a look that suggested that butchering the princess's title might carry the same penalty as smuggling weapons-grade antimatter. Thomas tried again. "I'm in your radiant highness." The words stumbled over his tongue, heavy with centuries of ceremonial weight. It was the first hour of the first day, and he'd already made a fool of himself. Lyra, the princess at the center of all this, sat poised upon a crystalline dais, robes draped around her like flowing liquid metal. Her ears, longer than most, curved back elegantly, catching the soft, violet light. If she was offended, her face betrayed nothing, though the smallest flicker at the corner of her mouth hinted at amusement. To break the ice, Thomas offered a lopsided smile. "First contact manuals didn't quite prepare me for an audience this sparkly." Silence. Somewhere behind him, a servant inhaled sharply. Thomas winced. Humor, it seemed, did not translate across parsecs as easily as he'd hoped. As the courtiers resumed their measured breathing, Varos's voice cut through the tension, explaining the agenda. Holographic scrolls unfolded in the air, data spiraling into elegant Illyrian script. Thomas had been invited to help navigate linguistic nuances in a new trade pact between humans and the Illyrian high houses, but the task felt like disarming a plasma charge with chopsticks. Later, during a recess, he found himself wandering the palace's inner garden, an improbable forest thriving beneath the dome of artificial stars. Bioluminescent vines traced symbols of old treaties across living bark. The air tasted faintly metallic, tinged with ionized mist. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead, trying to recall the 100 ceremonial phrases Varos had drilled into him. A soft voice startled him. "We do not often see humans here, Thomas of Earth." He turned, nearly tripping over a root that glowed, a soft indigo. Lyra stood a few steps away, hands folded, her gaze curious rather than cold. "I suspect that's because most humans have the good sense to stay home," he quipped, then regretted it instantly. His translator hummed, relaying the words, but instead of offense, Lyra's lips curved into something almost like a smile. "And yet, you did not," she replied. Her accent lent a melodic cadence to the common tongue, each syllable deliberate and clear were a summons so compelling. Thomas shifted, brushing pollen from his sleeve. "I'd say it was the promise of an interstellar buffet, but in truth, I'm here to help your people and mine understand each other." Lyra tilted her head, long ears catching the glow of a nearby vine. "And do you find us so difficult to understand?" "I find everyone difficult to understand," Thomas admitted. "Humans included." He hesitated. "But I'm learning." "And what have you learned of us, Thomas?" "That your etiquette guides could flatten a small moon," he said before he could stop himself. The joke hovered, delicate as a dust mote, and to his relief, Lyra let out a soft, genuine laugh, a brief sound that seemed to echo among the glowing leaves. Their conversation drifted to language, how Illyrian vowels shifted meaning depending on the speaker's posture, and how human idioms baffled even the best translators. Thomas explained the phrase, "break the ice," gesturing around them. Lyra listened, eyes bright, the corner of her mouth twitching as she tried out the words herself. A bell, chiming like resonating crystal, summoned them back. Lyra's expression shifted, as though a mask fell into place. "Duty waits," she murmured. As ever, they returned to the grand hall, now illuminated by pillars of suspended light particles. Courtiers whispered behind jeweled masks, speculating about the humans' unguarded exchange with the princess. Thomas felt the weight of 100 alien gazes, but Lyra's calm presence steadied him. During the next round of discussions, Thomas stumbled over an archaic term that, as Varos later whispered in horror, roughly translated to exalted cucumber. Lyra's ears twitched, and her lips pressed together in a battle against laughter. Thomas offered an apologetic shrug. "Languages are like wild animals," he whispered, "bite you when you least expect it." When the session finally adjourned, Thomas trudged toward his temporary quarters-polished crystal walls, reflecting his tired face at every turn. Yet he found himself smiling, recalling Lyra's laughter. For a moment he felt less like an outsider and more like someone who could belong in the quiet of his room. Beneath a ceiling alive with drifting constellations, Thomas reviewed his notes for the next day. Pages of dense diplomatic phrasing, ceremonial forms of address, and ancient proverbs scrolled by on his tablet. His eyelids grew heavy. Outside, the palace hummed with hidden energy, currents of power and tradition flowing through every corridor, before sleep claimed him. One thought surfaced through the haze. Whatever the days ahead held, misunderstandings, or worse, there was something undeniably human, and maybe something deeply universal, in trying to make someone laugh. Even in a palace of crystal and stars, humor could cross light years, and perhaps, he dared hope, it could bridge hearts too. Thomas woke to a soft chime that pulsed through the crystalline walls. As though the entire palace breathed around him, he sat up, sheets of silken moss fiber tangled at his feet, blinking away a dream of falling through endless nebulae. The tablet beside him flickered to life, lines of Illyrian script dancing across the screen like a challenge he hadn't agreed to face before breakfast. He dressed quickly, struggling again with the high-collared robe. Varos insisted he wore a garment seemingly engineered to strangle humans at the slightest shrug. The mirror projected his reflection in real time, subtly correcting posture and smoothing fabric with holographic overlays. It didn't fix the confusion in his eyes. Stepping into the hall, he found Varos waiting, expression as stony as ever. "You will remember," Varos intoned, "that today's audience requires you to address her radiance not directly, but through the conclave speaker, unless she herself speaks first." "I'll try," Thomas said, tugging at his collar. "But if I faint from lack of oxygen, please catch me." The corridor curved like the spine of some ancient leviathan, its walls alive with streams of pale light mapping energy flows through. The palace, at intervals, floating orbs displayed fragments of Illyrian history, past rulers whose long ears and stern gazes watched him in silent judgment. Thomas tried not to look too closely, lest he trip again on a seam in the polished crystal floor. They arrived at the Hall of Mirrors, a chamber lined with panels that shimmered with living reflections, each surface catching not just faces but thoughts, rippling into patterns of color. Lyra stood at its heart, robed and silver-threaded with dark strands that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Thomas bowed, hoping the motion matched the diagrams Varos had shown him. Illyrian courtiers gathered around, masks covering half their faces, expressions hidden but eyes alert. The conclave speaker, an older Illyrian whose ears bore golden bands of office, welcomed Thomas in sonorous tones. Then it began discussions of trade routes, resource quotas, and tariffs that sounded like coded poetry. Thomas tried to follow, his translator whispering meanings that shifted depending on context. Occasionally, the speaker turned, relaying Lyra's words to him, even though she stood within earshot. Protocol, Varos had warned, weighed more than gravity itself here at one point. A noble challenged a phrase Thomas had suggested. In human speech, the noble declared, such words seem blunt, almost savage. Thomas raised a hand, smiling. "That's fair. Humans can be blunt, but in fairness, our mouths were designed for chewing tough root vegetables, not for reciting your poetry." A flicker of amusement crossed Lyra's eyes, quickly hidden. The noble, momentarily disarmed, offered a curt nod. Even Varos seemed to exhale. Hours crawled by, the conversation looping back on itself like a spiral galaxy. Thomas caught himself doodling on his notes, stick figures with long ears negotiating peace treaties. When a question finally came directly from Lyra, bypassing the speaker, it startled him. "Thomas," she asked, voice echoing faintly against the mirrored walls, "do your people truly value honesty above form?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "Other times we value winning arguments over being honest. But the good ones try." The speaker cleared his throat, but Lyra's gaze stayed on Thomas, as if weighing the answer. The silence stretched until another noble interjected, and protocol resumed its iron grip. A break came at last. Thomas retreated to a side alcove, shoulders aching. He found a flask of spiced water waiting a thoughtful gesture, though the flavor burned like cinnamon on steroids. He coughed, eyes watering. Lyra appeared, as silently as a shifting shadow. "Are you harmed?" "Only my pride," he wheezed. "I didn't expect alien tea to have the kick of a plasma burst." She laughed. "Quietly, it is brewed to awaken the mind before debate." "Next time," Thomas said, "I'll remember to brace for impact." They spoke softly, the tension of ceremony draining away. Lyra confessed her frustration, the way her words were filtered, how the speaker's voice dulled what she meant. Thomas listened, nodding, careful not to interrupt. "You see us through unclouded eyes," she said. "Perhaps that is why they fear you." "I'm just a translator with a bad sense of balance," he replied, "though I suppose that's threatening in its own way." Her ears twitched a silent laugh she didn't voice aloud. Beyond them, courtiers glanced over, whispers trailing like spectral threads. Lyra's posture straightened, mask of royalty returning. "Duty calls," she murmured, stepping away. When the session resumed, the room felt subtly colder. A noble pressed Thomas, questioning his role. Was he merely a tool of human interest? Thomas met the accusation with a lopsided grin. "My people barely agree on lunch plans, conspiring against an empire. We'd argue for weeks about the font on the secret memo." A ripple of reluctant laughter eased the moment. Yet the noble's gaze lingered, sharp as a blade. Thomas sensed undercurrents he couldn't fully translate: resentment, fear of change, something deeper. By day's end, the trade pact's language had shifted. Phrases softened, meanings rebalanced. Thomas felt the strain in every word, but also a small spark of pride. The sun beyond the dome set into crimson haze, the palace lighting itself from within. In the fading glow, Lyra's gaze met his once more. No words passed, but something unspoken settled between them. Fragile, real, and dangerously outside protocol's reach. Returning to his quarters, Thomas collapsed onto the bed, robe tangled. Mind buzzing with ancient language and modern fear, he replayed every stumble, every laugh, every glance. Outside, the palace lights dimmed, shifting to patterns that mimicked a living galaxy. Sleep tugged at him, but so did something else, a realization that humor, honesty, and mistakes had cracked, opened doors that eloquence alone could never touch. And behind one of those doors stood La Royalty in a cage of custom, who'd chosen, for a moment, to speak directly, unfiltered. For the first time, Thomas wondered if that moment would cost them both more than either could guess. The garden, at night, felt like drifting inside the skeleton of a sleeping starship. Bioluminescent vines coiled around crystal arches, and soft threads of nanite mist shimmered across the pathways, singing faint harmonics only half caught by human ears. Thomas paused under a towering bloom shaped like a spinning galaxy, its petals unfurling with slow precision. He'd been summoned not by Varos or the conclave speaker, but by Lyra herself. The message, etched in delicate Illyrian script on a wafer-thin hololeaf, had simply read, "Meet me where the vines remember." Poetic, also uncomfortably cryptic. Thomas worried he'd misinterpret it and end up chatting with a shrub, but she was there, waiting near a pool of liquid light, her reflection rippling beside her own image in the water. Her robes tonight were woven with dark filaments that caught stray photons, making her seem half absorbed into the night around them. "You came," Lyra said, as if mildly surprised by his ability to follow directions. "I had to," Thomas replied. "Your garden threatened to file a missing persons report if I didn't." A smile tugged at her lips, quickly hidden. "Do your people always answer solemn invitations with jokes?" "Only when we're nervous," Thomas said. "And sometimes when we're not. It's a flaw in the system." Her gaze softened, and for a moment the rigid distance imposed by protocol seemed to melt away, like frost meeting sunrise. "I wanted to speak," she began, her voice lower than before, without the conclave's ears, without the mirrored walls listening. "Just the two of us and several thousand sentient vines," Thomas said. "Perfectly private." Lyra's laugh, brief and genuine, seemed to make the bioluminescence brighten a shade. They walked slowly along the path, shoes sinking slightly into moss that glowed with each step. Lyra spoke of her childhood learning diplomatic forms before she could even read. Her first ceremonial oath recited in a hall so vast it distorted sound. Thomas listened, trying to imagine a life so scripted that even the pauses between words were measured. "You see me differently," Lyra said. "Unhidden it is, disconcerting." "I suspect that's because I don't know enough to be properly terrified," Thomas admitted. "Though Varos is trying his best to fix that." At this, Lyra's ears twitched, the Illyrian equivalent of a smothered laugh. "You challenge the order of things merely by speaking freely." "I'm sorry," Thomas said. "It's a human defect. Like our knees, they bend the wrong way sometimes." She turned to look at him, and in that moment the formal mask slipped. "Do you truly not fear me?" "I'd be an idiot not to," Thomas answered. "You could end my career with half a sentence. But fear doesn't mean I stop seeing you as a person." The words hung between them, heavier than they should have been. Beyond them, the garden's song shifted, the nanite mist harmonizing with a pulse of hidden energy conduits, a living symphony that hinted at ancient engineering still beyond human understanding. Thomas wondered if Lyra heard it too, or if it had always been part of her world, like the air. Unnoticed, until pointed out. "I have spent my life being watched," Lyra whispered. Every word weighed, every gesture catalogued. "And yet," Thomas said, "you still invited the clumsiest human in the galaxy to walk beside you. That's either bravery or extremely poor judgment." She laughed again, longer this time, and the vines above them unfurled new petals, spilling faint golden light across the path. Silence settled, but it felt companionable rather than forced. Thomas risked a question. "Why me?" Lyra hesitated. "Because you are not bound by our history. You do not carry the fear they do." "The fear of what?" "Of change," she said softly. "Of someone seeing behind the title and refusing to look away." Thomas exhaled, realizing his palms had curled into fists. "Change isn't always bad," he said. "Once humanity discovered coffee and decided civilization was worth the effort." "I do not know this coffee," Lyra said. "A beverage capable of both miracles and regrettable decisions," Thomas explained. "We revere it. Some say it's the true ruler of Earth." Her laughter rang bright against the ancient stone, and, singing mist, they came to a halt beside an ancient pillar etched with spirals of text so old the language had no living speakers. Lyra traced the carvings with a fingertip. "This was built when my people first left our cradle world. They wrote here their promise never to forget where they came from." Thomas looked at the symbols, wondering how many had tried and failed to keep that promise. "I think forgetting is easy," he said quietly. "Remembering takes work." Lyra's gaze met his, sharp yet strangely open. "And you would help us remember?" "I'd settle for helping you laugh again," Thomas replied. "But yes, if you let me." Her answer came not in words but in the way her shoulders loosened. The faintest easing of an invisible weight, a chime far off in the palace called them back. The sound as delicate as shattering glass. Duty reasserted itself, heavy as planetary gravity. As they turned toward the lighted path, Thomas couldn't resist. If anyone asks, we were just negotiating the brightness of the moon. An important matter, Lyra agreed, ears twitching, and one likely to be misunderstood. They walked back side by side, steps slow, as if both wished to stretch the moments thin as possible. The garden faded behind them, but something between them felt newly alive, divine, official, fragile, and precious. In the coming days, Thomas knew he'd stand again in halls of mirrored judgment, but tonight, in the hidden heart of an ancient garden, he'd found something the courtiers could neither script nor silence, a shared spark, small and human, yet capable maybe of lighting even the coldest crystal holes. Thomas had barely stepped into the Hall of Living Stars when the first ripple of alarms swept through the assembled courtiers. Whispers fluttered like startled birds, eyes darting from him to the princess and back again. He'd grown used to suspicion since arriving, but today the air felt charged. Like static before a lightning strike, Varos appeared at his side, voice low, walk carefully, Thomas. Rumors have teeth. Rumors usually prefer ankles, Thomas muttered, forcing a crooked grin. Mine must look especially tasty. At the center of the hall, Lyra stood beneath an arc of hovering glyphs. The light of those ancient symbols shimmered across her features, but her gaze flickered toward Thomas just once, brief, soft, and gone in the space of a breath. The speaker's voice boomed, layered through harmonic filters that lent it an almost mechanical grandeur. We gather to review the human delegates' contributions. Let all words be weighed. Thomas straightened his robe, which immediately tried to strangle him again, and stepped forward. A series of holographic panels spun around him, displaying the revised treaty language he'd helped shape: trade concessions, resource sharing, cultural exchange, terms that had seemed dry on paper but now glowed like living code in the air. A noble in robes so stiff they could have deflected meteorites stepped into the circle. We questioned, the noble intoned, whether these words truly honor our traditions or merely flatter the invader's tongue. Thomas blinked. Invader's a bit strong, he said. I only invaded the dessert table at lunch, a collective intake of breath. Lyra's eyes widened for a moment before her expression smoothed back into the practiced serenity of royalty. The noble didn't flinch. Your levity insults these sacred halls. Possibly, Thomas admitted. But nervous talking is sort of my specialty. Without it, I'd just stand here sweating. For an instant, the hall felt less like a minefield. Even some courtiers exchanged reluctant glances, as if trying to suppress amusement. Another noble, this one with filaments of circuitry woven into her robes, spoke. Your words reached our princess beyond the speaker's filter. Do you deny it? Thomas swallowed. I don't deny speaking to her directly, he said, nor that I might have said less diplomatic things. The noble's eyes glinted, catching the pulse of the floating glyphs. Then you admit to subverting our ways. Thomas shifted. Maybe I was just trying to understand her without footnotes. Whispers swelled, data scrolls flickering as courtiers updated their private records. The speaker raised a hand, steadying the room. And what was said? Thomas hesitated. I said she was beautiful. Gasps swept the hall. Energy staff tips brightened, ready to snap into defense mode. Thomas felt the hair on his arms rise as the hall's hidden defense grid hummed to readiness. Why speak such words? The noble demanded. Thomas tried to steady his voice because it was true, and because sometimes the truth matters more than protocol. Silence pressed in, thick as the vacuum between stars. Then Lyra stepped forward, breaking the sacred geometry of her station. He spoke truth, she said, her voice clear, and for that I am grateful. A murmur rose, the hull fracturing between shock and sudden curiosity. Thomas caught Varos, staring, mouth slightly open. Before the older man remembered to school his face, a tremor shook the floor subtle, but enough that Thomas had to brace himself. Floating glyphs flickered, and somewhere in the distance an alarm pulsed once, sharp and short. Lyra's eyes sharpened. Explain, she commanded, voice edged with steel. A guard sprinted in, breath ragged. Sabotage, he gasped. A power conduit was breached near the archive vaults. Fire suppression engaged, but damage is spreading. Before Thomas could think, Lyra was already moving. He chased after her, nearly tripping on his own robe. You know, he panted, running in diplomatic robes really needs to be covered in the welcome manual. They raced through corridors lit by frantic red pulses. Energy shields shimmered in the distance, sealing off threatened sections. Data spirits transparent. Floating AI constructs flitted past, relaying real-time status reports and streams of shifting symbols. Near the archive vaults, acrid smoke curled through vents, and flames licked across an ancient mural of Illyrian history. Lyra barked orders in her native tongue, voice ringing with command. Guards formed a perimeter, but Thomas could see it. The sabotage had targeted not just infrastructure but memory itself. The vaults stored centuries of cultural data, treaties, ancestral records. Who would do this? Thomas asked, coughing. Those who fear what change brings, Lyra said. And what you represent. He almost made a joke, something about being an accidental revolutionary, but bit it back. Instead, he joined her at a console. Its interface shimmered in impossible geometry, alien symbols folding into themselves. "I can't read this," Thomas admitted, "but I can press buttons with heroic determination." Lyra's ears twitched, but she only said, "Hold this sequence stable." Together, they stabilized the failing power grid, fingers moving across haptic fields that responded with warmth and soft pulses of light. Alarms eased, flames receded behind shimmered shields, data spirits flickered in relief. When it was over, they stood in the haze, shoulders brushing. Thomas let out a shaky laugh. "Well, that's one way to spend an afternoon." Lyra turned, eyes catching the last pulse of red light. "You risked much." "I'm already in trouble for talking," Thomas said. "Might as well add saving priceless cultural artifacts to the list." Her smile, small and weary, was answer enough, but in that half-ruined hall, Thomas understood. Humor had kept him standing, but it had also opened a door Lyra had stepped through, and somewhere, unseen, someone had just decided that door was dangerous enough to burn. The Grand Assembly gathered in the Hall of Harmonies, its vast crystal canopy alive with swirling constellations that shifted and shimmered as if the very stars were listening. Thomas stood at the center, robe slightly scorched at the hem from yesterday's sabotage and confidence only slightly less charred. The courtiers ringed him in tears, faces half hidden behind ceremonial masks inlaid with circuitry that pulsed faintly to each heartbeat. Lyra sat upon the high dais, her gaze steady, ears tipped forward just so a subtle sign he'd learned meant worry edged with resolve. Nearby, Veros hovered like a moon caught in tense orbit, his eyes darting from Thomas to the assembled nobles. The conclave speaker's voice resonated through layered harmonic amplifiers. "Thomas of Earth, your presence among us has sown both possibility and peril. You stand accused of breaking sacred custom, stirring rebellion of thought and drawing the princess beyond the walls of protocol." Thomas cleared his throat, translator humming. "With respect, your customs are very good at building walls. I'm better at tripping over them." A ripple of uneasy amusement fluttered across the chamber. Lyra's gaze warmed for a heartbeat. Before she composed her expression once more, the noble who had challenged him days ago stepped forward, robes stiff as ever. "We do not need an alien's careless words to fracture our unity." Thomas swallowed. "Maybe not," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "But maybe you do need someone to remind you why you speak at all. Protocol without purpose becomes a cage. And I don't think your people built all this." He gestured to the living crystal, the floating glyphs, the song of data spirits humming around them, just to watch it turn to dust behind walls of silence. A hush spread through the court, the very walls seeming to pause in their faint harmonic resonance. Lyra rose, the silver in her robe catching stray motes of light until she seemed wrapped in a quiet halo. "I have heard him speak without translation," she said, voice clear as morning over frozen plains. "He called me beautiful not as a princess, but as a person. In that truth, raw and unfiltered, I saw a path beyond fear." The speaker's harmonic voice dropped into lower, somber chords. "And do you, princess, stand by these words despite the threat to order?" "I do," Lyra answered. "Order built on silence is brittle. Let it bend before it breaks." The noble spoke again, desperation edging into his tone. "Then let the human answer this. Why risk so much for a world not your own?" Thomas exhaled. "Because it is my world now," he said quietly. "Because I came here thinking I was just a translator, only to find words mean nothing until you risk saying them. And because when someone like Lyra listens, truly listens, you can't pretend not to care anymore." The chamber seemed to breathe in, crystal panels dimming, then brightening as data spirits drifted above like luminous jellyfish. At last, the speaker's voice deepened, harmonics resonating through floor and bone alike. "This court recognizes your words, Thomas of Earth. Your breach remains," he intoned. "But so does the truth it revealed. We will not forget." A murmur spread through the court, less of scandal now and more of something Thomas dared to hope was acceptance or at least curiosity. Lyra descended from the dais, her steps deliberate, ceremonial barriers ignored. Standing before him, she spoke softly enough only he could hear. "They may never fully understand," she said, "but they will remember. And so will I." Thomas tried for humor, voice rough. "So, does this mean I keep the robe?" She laughed, a small, bright sound that seemed to catch in the facets of the hall, multiplying like dawn-striking crystal. "Keep it," she said, "though perhaps choose one less flammable next time." Veros approached, lines of tension easing from his face. "You have changed more than words here," he murmured, almost begrudgingly. Together, they stepped onto the dais, Lyra's hand brushing his just enough to be felt, hidden from the court's gaze. The speaker concluded the session, ancient tones mixing with data spirits whose harmonic trails folded into the official record in the days that followed. The trade pact was signed. Human and Illyrian delegates met not in mirrored halls but under the living garden's bioluminescent canopy, words flowing freer, laughter more easily shared. The archive vaults reopened, new protections humming quietly beneath crystal floors, and the rumor of a human who dared to speak plainly to the princess turned into a story shared in hushed amusement, then into something like respect. For Thomas, the court's labyrinthine etiquette never became easy. He still tripped on ceremonial robes, still forgot the difference between a respectful incline of the head and a catastrophic insult involving root vegetables. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer feared the silence that followed. Truth. On the final evening before his return to Earth for formal debriefing, he walked once more through the garden of singing vines. Lyra waited beneath the same spiraling bloom, its petals reflecting the glow of distant nebulae. "You could stay," she said, voice soft but unflinching. "I could," Thomas answered, "and maybe I will. But even if I go, it doesn't mean I'm gone." She stepped closer, the light catching the graceful curve of her ears, the quiet resolve in her gaze. "Then speak, Thomas," she said, without fear. He did, and though the words themselves were simple, the moment they bridged needed no translation at all. When he finally departed, the mirrored halls no longer felt like walls but windows open to possibility, to change, to a truth spoken once without intent, yet powerful enough to bend centuries of silence. And somewhere deep in the living crystal of the palace, the record kept a single, unadorned entry among the oaths and formal pronouncements. He said she was beautiful, and she listened.